Ever wonder what the secret is to transform your good design ideas into great studio projects that actually impress your professors and peers? In this episode, we're peeling back the curtain and, revealing what secrets we found from our 5 years in architecture school.
So, you're starting on a new project and you just got handed the project brief. And now you're starting the research phase, but you don't quite know what to study or look into that would give your project that deeper, meaningful connection. Rest assured, we're here to help.
Well, in this episode, we're diving into the nuts and bolts of the concept and schematic phases where we take a step back and really understand what goes on in the beginning phases of design.
So, today we're going to break down how to start your research and create a meaningful foundation for your design, how to turn these abstract ideas to the tangible ones they can put down on paper, and some of our personal stories where we got that aha moment that really got our projects going.
So grab your sketchbook, pull up Wikipedia, and let's jump into it.
In five, four, three, two, one. Welcome back to the Crit Room Podcast, everybody. I am your host, Ryan, with my co-host.
Albertosaurus Rex.
He's back again.
Although I don't have a hole in my tongue anymore, so.
That's great. Did it heal over? Or you
Yeah, it
still have a
did.
crater?
I mean, there's still, I can feel the crater, but it's not like affecting me like last time, so that's a good thing.
Okay, real quick before we jump into the episode, I just have to say this because what an incredible movie. If you haven't seen it already, please go and watch this movie. Dune 2. Wow. Wow, wow, wow.
On a scale of 1 to 10, how good was it? Because I haven't seen it before.
Okay, I can't answer that completely and 100% accurately just because I'm still like high off of the Dune vibes, the spice. But it's like, all I'll say is this, without any spoilers, without anything. I was more engaged in that movie than I've ever been since Endgame.
Really?
Like, gripping the seat, sweating profusely, heart racing, that kind of stuff. Like, I
It
was so
was
embedded in this movie.
it was that action driven and like story driven.
Not even necessarily, like, yes, there are action sequences. Yes, there's a big storyline going on, but it's just the tension in it. The whole time, it's just like, every single moment just feels like it's building off on something. And again, I won't go into too many spoilers. You have to watch this movie, but wow, dude. Wow.
The way you're describing it reminds me a lot of like Game of Thrones, where they're building like these characters and the storylines and like the things that are happening in the background, and then when it finally happens towards like the end of the season, you're like, "Yep, did not see that coming," but still pretty. That was amazing.
Well, I mean, I've never read the books, and honestly, this is a little bit of a selfish take maybe, but I'm glad I didn't because I love this adaptation of whatever they're doing and putting into the movie. I can't imagine myself loving the world building and everything else as much as I would just watching it on screen, if that makes
Wow.
sense.
Did you
Like
watch it in
sometimes I
4D?
think the movie just makes it so much more real.
I see, I see, I see. Did you watch it in 3D, or was it just like
It's
the
just
one?
like the IMAX, whatever.
Okay,
Actually, I
cool.
didn't watch it in IMAX. That's what I'm going to go back to watch it in. But whatever it was amazing.
I gotta go watch it too.
Dude, you'll love it. The world building is crazy.
Yeah.
But, anyways, on the topic of our episode, let's first talk about the research and preparation because, I mean, we talked about this in other episodes before. I think the research and preparation part is probably the most important part of your design process just because it sets everything up. It's the foundation of everything. If you have a horrible research and preparation phase, it's really hard to turn a great project out of that. So, by all means, this isn't like a complete list of items to research, but hopefully this can at least get you guys pointed in the right direction. I mean, ultimately, we think that, and especially for our last episode, that you should definitely find the things that excite you about architecture and whatever that opportunity is that comes with the project. So, if you are super passionate about structure systems or material studies, maybe that's what you want to begin with. But I think both Albert and I definitely frequently study these items the most, so that's what we're going to be talking about in today's episode. But what should we start out with first?
Well, in research phases, right, we think about research and do research in different scales of architecture where we start with small, or depending on who
Like
you
10 to
are.
the 1, 10 to the 2, 10 to the 3.
Yeah. Like, so 10 to the 1 was just, which is the smallest scale, would be like occupant studies. The 10 to the 2 would be the building itself. The 10 to the 3 would be like societal and like the location, the site, and just community. But I think what we should start out first is like the smallest one, which is the occupant studies.
Sure, yeah.
So, in the occupant studies, we typically try to understand who is going to be using the building that we are going to be designing, right? And
Because
typically,
architecture is about people. At the
yeah,
end of the day.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. Because, no one else is going to be using these buildings except us. Majority of architecture is trying to, we are fighting with the elements of the outside world, with being like rain, sun, the heat, the cold. But architecture is essentially built for us. And so now we need to understand what we need inside that building, or like what we need in general for people, so that this place can become meaningful. And so I wanted to ask you, Ryan, first and foremost, what are some things that you did in the beginning, or some things that you studied that you think would be really important to studying the 10 to the 1 scale for research phase?
I think, well, one part is, I know we talked about this in a couple other episodes before, but when you go outside of architecture to find some inspiration from other design disciplines and trying to take some of those aspects and bringing them back, there's a really cool part of the research phase I like from user experience design, where they create these avatars, if you will, right? They make up these pretend characters that they're imagining are going to be interacting with their building all the time. So, for example, they might say like, oh, Paul's going to be somebody that he's 34 years old and he just got hired at this place. Like, let's pretend it's an office building we're doing, right? So Paul's 34. He goes into work and he's just trying to, take care of what he needs to and get back onto his kids.
Does he have
And,
kids?
Not this guy, no. Yeah. He has different priorities.
Yeah, okay.
But like, the entire idea is based off of something that I've seen from, or it combos with this TED Talk I saw from OMA. They were talking about their CCTV building in Beijing, China. Essentially, they created this whole user case study where they were trying to come up with as many characters as possible that would be interacting with their building, and trying to imagine what their experience would be walking in and out of the building and going through their daily lives within that space. And the reason why they did that, some people might say like, oh wow, that sounds like a lot of extra work. And yeah, it kind of is.
Yeah.
You're coming up with all these pretend avatars and you don't really know exactly what they're going to do.
Yeah.
But it helps. Ultimately, I think it's a tool to help you really understand who you're creating it for and what they might find important about this project. Because I think Albert was talking about this before, but it's like, it's not necessarily like, the designers themselves. They're usually not going to be the ones that had to deal with it. It's going to be the people that we're creating this project for that are going to be interacting with it all the time. So what will their experience be like? And are we designing to aid in their experience, or benefit their experience, or whatever else? I think that's one of the biggest reasons why that might be a pretty helpful tool to think about.
Right. I think what's really important is the character building itself. So when you start a project, you need something that you can connect with. And especially if the research that you've read within that location already is super diverse, and you're trying to understand what their stories are, you need to understand who the quote-unquote characters are within the storybook. And so maybe your program or the project brief gave you this idea that it is going to be a school for the people of New Mexico. That's my thesis. A school for New Mexico. A school for New Mexico. And in New Mexico, there's a lot of students who are missing out in school, and especially in high school. From my standpoint, I'm like, okay, what is their story? And so I started building out these personas of what their life could be, and also going there to see actually if that was an actual like true statement or story that I was building. And so I would build up who was going to use the space: parents, teachers, students, and then okay, if it's a student, what is their daily life like? So they start home, map out, okay, if they're starting from home, are they going to go to school through bus? Are they going to walk there? Are they going to do like, they're gonna get dropped off by their parents, and from there, do they have work after school? Where do they go after school? They go home? Do they go back to like McDonald's or something and work there? And then from there, do they hang out with friends? What are these things that like make us human? What are the things that makes us us? And see if there's anything that we can try to latch on to give ourselves some connection to the people who are using the space.
I was thinking too, you were talking about connecting with people, right? And just creating spaces that help facilitate what their lifestyles are like. One of the things that just popped into my mind actually was your domestic violence shelter project.
Oh, right, yeah.
There's one rendering in particular that I keep thinking about. It's the one where you're showing, I don't know what the actual program name for it was called, but it's like their living rooms or their, like their apartments maybe.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But to me, that's like the perfect embodiment of what it means to design for a particular persona or avatar, where you're seeing like, oh, it's a mother and her child. How do we design this space to particularly cater to that bond with her child and everything? Like,
Yeah.
how does that go into creating the bedrooms? And obviously, I'm not trying to talk your project because what do I know? But it's just like the things that I've seen from it that I'm like, wow, that's observing it and being like, wow, I can see those moves coming out. Like, it feels like it's designed for a particular person, not just a random developer.
Yeah.
Here's an apartment studio that has like a kitchen here, an empty room, and a bedroom.
Yeah, it feels like you're carving out a space for a specific person. So just for
Yeah.
a reference, right? So the Domestic Violence Co-Housing Project, the people that were using it were the people, obviously the people from the community, and wanted to see how they could interact with the building. But the major people who were going to use it were women who were domestically abused or survived through their encounters with their abusers from their homes. And so this was a place where they could start to gain independence and heal from that trauma. But not only were they women that were basically the ones that were using the space, but it was also children. And so there's a human scale aspect that I really need to hone in on, where us adults are going to be viewing the world from a very different perspective, where, because as a child, you think everything is massive. And so how do you design a space where it's for them? And so maybe you start to scale down where the windows start to become like, do they become shorter? Do they become more tiny? And then when they're in the beds, they like to play around. So do you design a space where they can have a little fort inside? That's what I did, where, there was a bed that they would climb over, but then there was also this little treasure nest
Hideaway thing.
Yeah, hideaway thing underneath their beds that had its own window. And so like really shaping the space so that it's for the people that's going to be using it is super important on how you try to visualize what this architecture could be.
Yeah. And let's pretend that maybe you're someone who doesn't quite believe that you have to be super specific with your avatar building. And I can see a certain validity to that as well. If you wanted to keep it more vague, the one project I'm thinking about that I did was the Boys and Girls Club for Alma, Kansas. And the particular thing I was thinking about is that was a very specific project that was based on that general idea of occupant studies. We had to accommodate 3 different age groups plus adults. They're just the staff of the building. So you have to really put yourself back into your own memories of being a child at those different stages of life and everything, and try to figure out like, what was I into when I was that age, and how can I design this space to be for teenagers specifically that wouldn't be the same thing for kids who are 3 and 4 years old, and those kids who are kind of in between and everything. And when it came down to creating those personas and then applying it to spaces designed for those people in the program, it came down to also studying how the space could accommodate those different things. There's a part of the project where it's always like, the way that I organized the building, the only place that I had space for the rest of the program, for the kids program, was it was in the basement. So then I'm like, oh no, I can't have kids in the basement. That sounds horrible. But then that added to it to be, how can we push this further and actually make this become a very inviting space? If it's a basement, you're already using a pretty compacted space. Like the floor to ceiling height is probably nothing more than 8 feet or so, which is fairly compact, very intimate. But using that to its advantage is saying like, well, no, if you're having like 3 and 4 year olds, the teachers there, like the staff, are going to want to be a lot more intimate and engaged with these kids. So then having it be smaller scale, like Albert was saying, actually benefits it, because to these kids, these are like 12-foot ceilings, you know? So it's kind of like finding the opportunities in your projects that can benefit from these different personas or different avatars.
Right.
And what it be.
When you said the idea of the different age groups within the Boys and Girls Club project you were saying, I think it's so important to understand what the different age groups that you are going to be working with, right? Because, okay, you haven't really thought about this, right? Where there is a reason why they separated elementary, middle school, and high school.
Right.
And it's not until you actually dive into the project itself where you start to wonder, why is that? And even through, like, even in elementary school, there's a specific, like, fifth graders and kindergartners can't be in the space together because they are just, there's a massive difference. They're giants versus like there's like there is a massive difference in why these spaces are, these people are separated, because they have different needs. And so you need to understand what their needs are, what the people's needs are, what do they want, ask them, and understand what that is.
And one last part of that too, before we move on to the second part, is even when it comes to accessibility, right? If you're designing something for an older age group, right, you're going to want to think a lot more about accessibility, elevation changes, and everything else. If you have to, because I think it's a general trend, once you get older, it's harder to walk for longer distances. So maybe that influences how long you actually create your hallways, because now, you know, your general occupancies are going to be people who are not able to walk that long in hallways compared to, you know, teenagers who can walk for billions of miles. So that's also something to think about. Or like, you know, like kids, right? Kids, like they're tiny little feet, so they can't really like walk a football field the same way that a normal adult could.
I was about to say, like, if you walk with have you walked with a toddler before in like a park before? My God, they have so much energy, and then after 5 minutes, they're like, "I'm tired of walking. Can I piggyback?" I'm like, bruh, you should have used all your energy like that.
So there's a lot of interesting things you can pick up from just trying to put yourself in the shoes of who's going to be using this building. But on the topic of buildings, I think building typology is another really good one to look into when you're doing research and trying to study and study and research for your project. This is one of my more favorite parts of
you're an expert at this. This is like your bread and butter.
I really like to nerd out on things, and I think typologies work so well because it's almost like symbolism, where you see a particular building and just by the way it looks, you already can figure out so many things about it. You stare at an office building, it's just a big glass cube or something. You're like, oh, it's an office building. I can pretty much exactly tell what this is going to be like on the inside. I know who's working there right now. I know when the building's used and all those things. And you just see an office building, right? But then you see like a house. Again, that's the typology. You already know pretty much exactly what's going to be happening on the inside. That's what people do to relax, spend time with family, etc., etc. So I think there's a lot of power into using typologies and trying to add on to it in a certain way that can really help your project begin to stand out. And I keep hating to hark on the whole Björk Ingels stuff, but it's a decent place to look at for these ideas, where they take two typologies and they mash them together. That's all I'm going to say.
Yeah. No, I think you make a great point, because that is something that we talked about my domestic violence co-housing project too. I want to talk about that one specifically because you really need to understand what the different typologies are. So typically there's a domestic violence shelter, which is this idea of a fortress where no one else can come in except the people who are using the space, where they are trying to heal and trying to isolate themselves away from their oppressors and abusers so that they can heal. And then the co-housing typology, which is, okay, I'm dealing with a lot of people. We have shared spaces, we have shared kitchens, we have shared living spaces. How do you start to mesh this idea of co-housing versus the shelter. Shelter being very isolated and very like focused on myself, co-housing being more open, yeah, very communal. Now you're sharing with a lot of people. What is the thing that we can try to figure out architecturally that deals with both the shelter and co-housing?
I'm thinking too, trying to think about the projects that I did back in the days with studio. I'm trying to think if there were any particular moments where I really tried to go above and beyond the typical typologies. I think when I usually have done that, it's not necessarily a programmatic exploration, but it's more of a exterior representation of these typologies and trying to figure out how to push those boundaries a little bit more and trying to figure out what you can do with these things. And I'm sure we talked about this in another episode from last season, but it's almost like the Pinterest board effect where you're just gathering ideas in the early initial stages and trying to come up with a general web of ideas of, okay, what does a firehouse look like? And we're going to see like, okay, most of these buildings have brick in them. They're usually have all the garage doors facing the front and they have like this single entry on the side and whatever else comes with it.
Right.
And you just come up with a bunch of other ones to try to find a unique twist on how to make those expressions read in a different way on the outside. That's what I really liked about doing precedent studies and finding the different typologies of how they express themselves.
Right. Okay, wait. Let me give you an example then. Let's say I just handed you down a project brief and you see that the typology is a, I don't know, like an apartment complex. Well, how would you approach this project?
So again, I think the first thing that I would typically do is bring very precedent forward. If it's going to be a very high density one, if it's going to be somewhat of a regular density or, you know, whatever that's going to be. And that will help shape some of my ideas too. But it all starts with finding what other types of apartment complexes exist out there and seeing how do they express these ideas, right? You have like an outdoor space. It's pretty much the same unit, copy and pasted upwards and so on and so forth. So trying to find very basic examples of it and trying to find more experimental examples of that. Some things like the capsule in Tokyo, or was it Tokyo?
Yeah. Or
Yeah,
Nagasaki? I don't know.
I forget. Oh,
The
God.
capsule tower.
The capsule, yeah, the capsule tower. So yeah, finding very basic expressions of a residential unit or building, and then finding more experimental ones like the capsule tower, and or even other ones like the Unite, and just seeing, wow, there's like a lot of different ways people have gone about this same design brief.
Right.
So then finding the unique influences that made the building look the way it does is really interesting to me to help stimulate some ideas in my head of, do we go with the simple copy paste the floor plans 10 stories up and then call it good? Well, that's kind of boring. Like, why would we want to do that? It kind of looks okay, but you know, there's nothing exciting about it. We've seen it a billion times. Let's look at some of these more experimental ones and say, oh, okay, so they're creating like these mountain forms with this, and they're pushing in and out these units in a rhythm, and then that's kind of an interesting pattern idea. Okay, we'll keep that in our back pocket. So once I come up with a lot of different visual representations to that typology, I definitely then go back into starting to research, like, okay, now that we've found a lot of these cool ideas, who is going to be using this, right? Are they going to benefit more from having that copy pasted floor to floor thing? And why would that be the case? Or are they going to benefit more from this staggered approach, and why would that be? And it's a symbiotic thing where both of them have to happen at the same time in my head for my process in order for them to fuse together in a more exciting or a more unique way.
Right. I wanted to focus on the thing that you said, which was the precedent studies. And I think it's super important to understand precedent studies because each building, or at least when you do precedent studies, each building has figured out a solution to a unique problem that they are facing. And with what Ryan was saying, that's exactly what he was studying, is like, what are these problems that they were facing, these typologies, and then what were the solutions that they came up with for those problems. And Ryan, I think he's an expert at doing this, because this man, I literally, he walks up to your project, or your desk, right, and then he looks at your project. He's like, "Oh shoot, I've seen this before," or not. I've seen that. This reminds me. This reminds me of this project. Have you looked at it before? I'm like, dude, that's actually super helpful. And so, yeah.
Aw, thanks. Yeah.
Another thing that I wanted to talk about too, Ryan, is that so when you get the project brief, right, you're given the spaces that you're going to be designing. How do you go about understanding where to place these spaces within that building?
That part I think I still struggle with quite a bit. I know there's a lot of people who like to do the bubble diagrams. If you don't know what that is, they take the program, they just circle the program name or something, right? And the idea is you have all the bubbles of the program around your page, but you're trying to group them in a certain way where what programs will benefit from other programs being adjacent to it. For example, you probably want to have a lot of the quote unquote core programs be right next to each other, such as elevators, bathrooms, and whatever else. And it doesn't always have to be that way, but that's a pretty traditional way of exploring things. So usually they'll have like the all three of those bubbles right next to each other in the floor plan. And then they'll say, well, how do you get to that? Well, you probably need a lobby to connect to that core so people can circulate up to the other floors. So they had the lobby in a bubble and they draw a line to that group of bubbles and everything. So that's a pretty good way to just get a general understanding of adjacencies without having to go right into the site and place a square of where each program is going to be by the square footage. At least that's what I've seen from other people. But then again, I think I fare better when I look at examples of what's happened in the past and try to think about how to improve upon certain things, or just study the general trends of how other buildings have done things and analyze how that can maybe be reverse engineered into a different way of laying things out. I know I didn't necessarily answer that question, but it's
No, I actually I do the same thing where in the beginning phases I try to understand what groups of spaces are going to be interacting with each other the most. And so like a classroom would be grouped with other classrooms, and maybe in a specific classroom there is a laboratory that students need to access. And so maybe then these are more grouped up together, but then outside of that there's a more private spaces where admins the admin offices are. You try to categorize these different spaces into the public, semi-public, semi-private,
That's
private
important.
categories, so that now you understand where to start placing them and within the context of what your
the
site.
site and everything.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think one other thing that's important to notice, I know we're talking about precedent studies, and usually that's just a very analytical approach to program. You're not necessarily trying to arrange it on site quite yet. You're basically studying how other people did it and what you can learn from how they did it. But I think a really important part about when you're starting to organize things is, especially when you can combine that with your concepts in the early development stage, I think that's when you can start to find some pretty interesting and unique ways of organizing those bubbles. I'm trying to think of an example on top of my head that shows how a concept can influence how you want to organize those bubbles in different ways.
Oh, there's
But
an
you can
OMA
you can start to
project.
hint towards how that might work, right?
Right. Yeah. There's an OMA project that was basically a diagram, or like, OMA is famous for doing their buildings like their diagrams. And so a lot of the time they have these sectional diagrammatic ideas that are super interesting because they look like they would read as bubble diagrams, but then they really translate really well into how it turns into a section and how they've like approached what it is that they're trying to do with their concept.
Yeah, that's a good point. Because when you think about it, I think most people think about laying out program. Well, that's not exactly true too. I know many people who do both approaches, doing it on a floor plan basis and doing it as a section basis. But it seems for the most part, OMA does a lot of studies in section.
Yeah. And, these things that they're doing is it's interesting because they try to approach like the simple bubble diagram, right? They try to approach it in a different and a unique way so that they can see architecture in a different way, right? Because typically, like we said earlier, typically bubble diagrams, I think most students would just be like, okay, this space will be connected to this space, and this is all in plan, right? But then with OMA, they take it to another level of, okay, so how does this relate into the spatial verticality? How does this relate to the behaviors of these spaces? How do they, like, these are the things that they're trying to diagram so that they can see architecture in a different way.
Yeah, I think one more thing that I'm just now thinking about this, but when it comes to precedent studies and materiality and understanding the context of where your project's at, I think looking at materiality in a precedent study is also really important, especially once you start to be given your site. Because, well, this is also one of the very first things that I do. I just take a look at the site itself and see what exists around it. And then I definitely take note of the materiality choices, right? Are you in the middle of a downtown where it's just a bunch of glass buildings around you? Or are you more in like a historical market area where there's just a lot of brick and stone and whatever else? Lots of wrought iron and everything else. And then trying to find even more unique parts like, oh, this building uses like copper roofs or something, right? Like, what can you find that's very unique about the place that you're
Right.
studying? And trying to also use that to influence what kind of things that you study, because you don't necessarily want to introduce something that's exactly matched to your context. We've had some professors in the past that have definitely voiced their opinions on that.
Yeah.
One thing I can think about is one of the professors, Yo Gabba Gabba, right? He was explaining to me in the Boys and Girls Club that I was trying to, I might have been going a little bit in the wrong direction, and he was trying to sway me one or the other way. But it was a very historical area, right? It's just some very small town in Kansas. So whatever's existed there has been there for a good 50 plus years. And what I was trying to do is, since it's going to be a whole new construction, it's like, man, it's kind of weird to just throw like a giant modern thing right into the middle of all this. So what can we do to at least minimize that contrast while still
Respecting the
keeping it respectful to the context? And I was trying to do a lot of these classic tropes of, you know, classical architecture, which is very symmetrical looking, and the facade has a certain way to it, the walls were a certain width and windows were a certain size. And he was bringing up a point of saying like, we don't really design buildings like that anymore, and it looks weird or tacky if you're trying to create an old fashioned looking building, quote unquote, in the modern day. And that made me think about things for a while, because I'm like, that is kind of true. You never really see people creating old school looking buildings anymore, because one, there's a whole bunch of reasons why. And honestly, we'll have an episode on this actually. I'm just remembering our calendar. So that's going to be a fun episode. But it made me think about, man, okay, so if we don't really build things the old fashioned way anymore, is there different ways to still accomplish the same things? And that made me think about context in a whole different respect. No longer is it just material. It's now, oh, what's the size of the windows that people use in their other buildings? What's the general proportions of the building that they're using, right? And you can start to study your context in a whole different way of, instead of just material, it's now what else exists. Are there certain datum lines that come across?
Right.
Are there
That's
plinths
just like,
and
yeah,
whatever
this is like
else?
the building right next door. Like, what can you take away from that building next door that you can put
Right.
into your building? That's
Right.
that's super important, because present studies can't really understand that because they're not on the same side as yours, and so
Yeah.
you need to study what that is and within the context.
We've already started to tiptoe into it, but we should also be more specific about location analysis, right? And like capturing the spirit of a place.
Yeah.
So, what do you do first when you're looking into a site and trying to research it?
Right. So, okay, first and foremost, within the project, something that I learned from Professor Hits Different was that we're always trying to bring in something new that nothing has ever been there before. So within the context of the location, it'd be like, okay, what are the different services? What are the different products that are within the city that are not there already? A project that we did for Nomas was really trying to understand what the different services were within that city, and something that we saw were that we saw in the specific location. I don't remember where it was, but it was, I think it was either in Texas or I think it was in Texas. But we saw that in K State, right? There's a lot of scooters everywhere,
Hmm.
and these bikes and like these things that you can just find on the side of the road and be like, oh, let me use this so I can get to one place faster. And so with this project, we were like, okay, that's something we see in K State, but that's not what we're seeing here in this specific city and specific location. Can we try to integrate this into our project building? And so now we're providing something that the city and the location is not providing, and so giving it more value within the city. So that's one thing that I would say when it comes to site or like the location specific research. You need to understand what is there versus what is not there, and you need to provide, or at least from my point of view, you need to provide something and give value to something that's not there, and give them something new to be excited about.
Hmm. On that note, I think it's also, you were talking about what's there and what's not there. I think this applies a lot easier to studio projects, not necessarily as well to the real world, because usually your client in the real world is very particular about what they're willing to pay for, what they're not willing to pay for.
Yeah.
But in the studio project, it's, spin the wheel and see what happens. You can just do whatever you want. So there are certain projects where like thinking about the Simona or whatever, right? Like there's a lot of context to deal with in terms of public space, the different kinds of people that are walking around, and who is going to interact with your building, and how your building can play a part of this larger project or something.
Right.
But then there's also things where when you're studying neighborhoods and you're talking with other people around and asking what would you guys want in this area, right? Let's pretend that they don't have a grocery store around,
Yeah.
or the closest grocery store they have to drive to, right?
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be great if they could have even just like a corner market in this brand new building that you're about to put on that site, right? And maybe you can spin that into adding your program and having a really good argument for it, because, we talked to the people, we found out that they need this grocery store. So instead of doing the barber shop that was originally planned in our program, maybe we switch that out and we do a grocery store instead.
Right.
And then see what happens with that. So it's cool when you get to have a building service the needs of people in a very place-driven reason.
That reminds me a lot of what Andrew was saying in the last episode, where so the building was right next door to this lawn or something.
The Capitol.
The Capitol lawn, where it's green, but not a lot of people will be using it because it's the Capitol's lawn. And so
Right.
he was like, "What if the building itself is a park? Like, what if we provide a park within the building?" And so he saw something within the location that inspired him to do something for his building. And he's providing something that was not being provided before, and that's being really important for location analysis.
Yeah, I think we also talked a little bit about how location context can influence your design choices between materiality and just proportions of buildings and all of that. But do you think there's anything else that's location specific that can, like within the context,
Right.
influence your design choices?
Right. I think it's also super important to understand the culture, because different locations have different cultural backgrounds. With San Antonio, compared to a lot of the other Texas cities, San Antonio is very Hispanic X, Latin X demographics. And so a lot of the things that they were doing really reminded you of like Hispanics, the Latinx community. And so then how do you tie that back into the building is super important, because you have to be respectful of the culture and the people around there. In New York, it'd be so different from San Antonio, because in New York City, you've been there before, it's very hustle and bustle, like everyone's trying to get the bread. So how do you how do you respect the getting the bread type of mentality within the architecture?
Right. No, that's a good point to bring up. Yeah, because if you're designing something in Italy, where the culture is a lot more slowed down and they value spending time with people and socializing, you definitely see a lot more outdoor seating, a lot more cafes that have that outdoor seating, plaza spaces where kids are running around and their parents are watching them from the edges or something on the bench. And versus New York City, they definitely have some of those things, but you find them less commonly, I think. And that's an interesting choice when you're thinking about specifically designing for a place, is that culture. That's that's a good idea.
Yeah, and like even in Philippines, right? Like it's super tropical and super like super humid because it's surrounded by water with these islands.
Oh my god, we didn't even talk about weather and stuff.
Yeah, like that's
the
like
climate. Yeah,
that is super important about like now it's you have to design how the wind and all these different things go through the building. Like these are the things that you need to understand, how the sun interacts within the building and all these different things.
Yeah. That was my bad. I was kind of just assuming. Everyone was like, "Oh yeah, the second year class or seminar. We'll keep that in our brain." Okay. The last thing I wanted to talk about too, before we moved on, is site visits. It's a little bit of an add-on because not everyone has the benefit to be able to physically visit their site, whether their project's halfway across the world or they just don't have, the time in the schedule to actually physically make it to the site.
Yeah.
But if you are fortunate enough to physically visit the site with your studio and your professor, there are a lot of things that you can get from it that you just can't do from the internet. Like being in person allows you to get so many other hyper detailed components of how that place works and functions that you just can't get from Google Maps or Google Earth. Although we will talk about that in just a second. Just from my experience, and I talked about this last episode too, so I'll keep it brief. But just walking around and seeing how people, the popularity of each sidewalk. Are people walking on one side versus the other? Are they coming from one particular direction mostly? And that can help influence where you put your front door. How's the street traffic? Are there a lot of people on that street? So it's going to be a lot noisier. Does that mean you put your apartments on the other side of that building then? Or, there's a lot of things that you can probably pick up that you just can't see or visualize so well from Google Earth or anything because it's just a static image.
Right.
One other thing I want to talk about is just talking with locals. We had a moment where we just spent basically an entire afternoon just walking around and taking notes in our sketchbooks and whatever else. But we also got to talk to some people who were sitting on their front porch, and we got to ask them like, "Hey, we're coming up with this project for studio, right, in our school. What would you like to see about this type of building?" And then they gave us so many cool insights that we just could never get from research articles or anything like that. So if you have those opportunities to talk to people in person, that's incredible. But even just emailing people. I think Abby did this where she found for the San Antonio project. She found this one artist that was local to San Antonio, and she reached out and DM'd her on Instagram. I don't remember exactly what she asked, but I remember she had a conversation with a local to ask about particular things and what they thought about stuff.
Yeah, that was cool because prior to that, I've never seen anyone do that before, and I was like, wow. Maybe we should start doing this more often. But I think it's also important, Ryan, like what you were saying was, this is where it goes back to your thesis. You experienced what the suburbs was like, and from the site visit, or like from just being there, living there. But also when you went to visit the city of New York, you also understood some type of element. So you were like started questioning about certain things. Could you elaborate on how that went for you?
Yeah. Our thesis, this wasn't widely popular with our professors. I just think we didn't explain it in the best of ways to make them quite understand where we're coming from. But the trend is lots of people choose to live in the suburbs, right? Everyone has a choice to live downtown or to live outside of downtown. And mostly it's a financial encouraged decision or influenced decision from finances and everything. But a lot of that also comes down to people just like the qualities of being on the suburbs, despite what research articles might say, right? Or it's like you have your own lawn, you have your own property, you have lots of space to spend time with family and have events in your backyards. And there's all these things that you have the benefit of with a house in the suburbs that you just don't have with a tiny apartment in the apartment complex. So Reggie and I, we were trying to figure out like, okay, is there a way where we can take like these really family focused dynamics of a suburb and try to bring those into a high density environment like New York City, well, particularly Brooklyn in this case. And I thought it went really well. Like, this was a very interesting study. To keep it very brief, it was just encouraging a lot more outdoor spaces and trying to find ways to include like 2-story units instead of just a single-story typical apartment unit. So there's a lot of interesting studies we got from thinking about pretty much everything that we talked about, right? It's just your occupancy avatars, your lifestyle studies, and typologies, right? All that blended into this really cool thesis idea.
Yeah, no, that was super interesting because what I understood from when you were presenting it was like, this is why people start to move to suburbs. And we've lived through there, and you guys have probably lived through there too. But then when we went to visit to New York, this is what we saw about big cities, and that they didn't have this type of values that would typically happen within the suburban environment.
Right.
And then
everyone's stuck in their shoebox apartment. They're not talking to each other really.
Right.
If they want to talk to each other, they have to get out of their apartment building.
Right.
Like, how backwards does that sound?
Right.
So
and yeah, that was super, super cool for me to understand. I was like, wow, you can make a project based on that.
So yeah, I might throw a little screenshot of our render if we can. But real quickly, I also wanted to just cover the Google Maps aspect because it is a very incredible tool for architects and architecture students. The biggest parts that I get from it is one, you get to really understand the context from an aerial view. You're seeing literally a bird's eye view of everything that's surrounding your building. And when you get the Google Earth, especially, you can have like 3D modeled buildings and understand the scale of things, understand the spacing, the lighting conditions, and everything else. Versus like a Google Street View, it's nice because you can understand more about the people walking along the sidewalks, where cars park, and all that. But you don't really get a sense of the true scale of all these buildings because it's so distorted and warped from the camera that they use.
Yeah.
But both of those tools are really powerful for getting a better idea of a site when you can't visit it in person.
And then that's also where you can take a screenshot of the Google Maps or Google Earth and then start to diagram like what like the different services within the city that you're trying to take a look at.
Yeah. So speaking of diagrams, let's start talking about the developing design concepts and everything, right? Transitioning from more of those abstract ideas into practical ideas. So you've done all your research, you figured out all these critical points of what your building's going to be, precedent studies, all of that. How do you begin to transform these abstract design concepts from your concept diagrams that you've developed and start to begin to turn those into practical, tangible elements? You know, are there like specific techniques that you can do?
I think you really have to touch on this idea of reflection of what you just read. So you have the information that you just gained. Now you have to reflect on the information to actually understand what is happening. Like one professor had us do was make art based on the research that we did. So then it started to tread on this idea of emotional qualities of what art can bring about, which then turned into how can we make a space feel like this, right?
Yeah.
So with the Simona project, at least what I understood was that the celebration of the different cultures in San Antonio. Okay, so that if that's the case, can we make an art that is about that? And so I started making these models that were like these rectangular, different colored shapes, which I could probably share within this recording here. It was this art piece where there were different colored rectangles with different colored basswood sticks that pierced through each culture, that was really trying to solve this idea of misunderstanding of different cultures and trying to provide a space for understandings to come about through conversation. And that was my piece. It was like, this model is about understanding through conversations. And then that concept piece then turned to this architectural moment of boxes that were individually look like they were different cultures, but then when you experience the space from the inside, you're like, oh wow, there's different dialogues that are happening inside within this building.
Yeah. I think another one too, because sometimes you don't always have an abstract idea for a concept. I definitely had that when I was in my earlier years, like first and second year. I wasn't quite really thinking creatively in that way, where I was thinking of abstract concepts that needed to be turned into architecture. And a lot of that came from like second year, you know, Professor Mies 2.0. A lot of his things are very influenced by just creating functional architecture in a way. Like your concept is tied more to how a building functions and performs and services people, rather than what's the idea and the feeling that we can provide from this architecture. So a lot of those designs, we had these, that's kind of what I was talking about earlier, where if your passion is more for like structure systems or materiality, this probably applies more to you and your thinking. It's like, how can we experiment on different structure types? What if we can use, like in a typology, let's say that arches aren't very common for this certain typology, but maybe you want to try and bring those arches into this typology, and how that concept of adding the arches influences how the space works and how the function of that space works and how that space feels too. So you can definitely go on the more practical sense if you wanted to with architecture concepts from your research and figuring out things that way. One of the examples from my specific project was with the farm incubator that we did. My concept for that one was definitely not an abstract one. It was purely focused on just the design process itself. It was all an incubator for agriculture components. So it was all about the research phase and coming up with some types of machinery that you can then test in the field. So I had a very simple diagram, and I'll hopefully remember to throw this up on the screen too. But it started out with like these tiny little labs that clicked into this bigger assembly hall or fabrication hall that I called it. And then there were these even bigger doors that would allow those bigger machines to then move out to then showcase to people and test it and then reverse engineer all the way back into the smaller components again. So it's this cyclical thing where every part of that was such a seamless blend between how do you get like these small little research parts, plug it into the big tractor, send it out to the field, see how it works. Okay, let's make some tweaks to it. Go bring it back in, find a new research part, build that prototype, try it again.
No, that's a really good idea because it reminded me of what some other students do, which was they proceed with their projects with this idea of reaching goals for their project goals. And so they'd be like, this project needs to respect culture. That's one. Two is provide a space for, let's say, students who have neurodiversity. It provides a space where now they are trying to understand what it is that the hypersensitive and hyposensitive peoples are. So what would it look like to have an introverted space and extroverted space? And so those are super, super important to the project goals. So they make a list of these things that you're trying to achieve with the project based on the research that they did. And so now they're trying to make these things that they did, which were abstract ideas from the research, now they're trying to make them more tangible by creating goals for the project. Another thing, too, is that maybe this is more towards the abstract part, which is what I did for the farmers market project, which was we noticed that, in farmers market, these people were typically trying to sell something that they've made. So there you'd see like the ceramic places or some honey jars and ceramics and those beanies, those gloves, those things that they knit. And we were like, okay, people really want their names to be heard. And that's that's the abstract idea. Being seen within the whole society, within the whole location. And so then how do you translate that into architecture? And what our professor had us do was, let's study this in textile form. Since these people are providing products that were made by them, why don't we try to create our own textile that we can then study to make architecture? And so within textiles, we started to figure out there are rules that they're trying to do. So like you would knit over here, over and under, and all these different things, which then created figures or symbols. So like you'd see an L-shaped or an S-shaped, or like these different things that you see visually. And then they would then start to create these different configurations within the figures. And so then we started to replicate these ideas within the architecture. So now we have different figures. How do these different rule sets that we see in the textiles, how do they transform into architecture?
One thing I was thinking about too, more of like a cautionary tale maybe, but it can easily fall into the realm of talkitecture, which is something that Professor Hits Different kept getting on us about. We would have these concepts that we'd write 3 sentences about, and we talked about this before, but a struggle that comes with the early schematic phases is you're still developing these ideas yet, and you're trying to figure out how to translate that from these abstract causes into the building itself. And a lot of the times you have to supplement a lot of what they call talkitecture, which is you're explaining your grand ideas of how you're about to do this thing, but you haven't done it yet. Like you haven't put pen to paper to show how this idea is going into this thing. So instead you end up talking about what you're about to do instead of actually doing it, which is where talkitecture comes from. And I would guess, what do you remember us doing when we were struggling with that a lot to get those ideas on the paper a lot quicker?
Right. I remember specifically, it was the first Simona project with the within the studio, I was hitting a creative slump. I was hitting like the creative blocks of I didn't know how to proceed with the project because there were just so many ideas. And so what Professor Hitstefan had us do was we would trade each other's concepts to each other, and then they would try to draw something from that concept. And
Right, I
I
remember this. Everyone put all their little things in a hat. I mean, went around
yeah,
campfire style and just picked one up and
yeah,
15-minute workshop. All right, you go
yeah,
draw every whatever you got in the
yeah.
hat.
We wrote our three sentences down on a piece of paper. We put it in a hat, and then we drew who was gonna draw what concept. And so, I think Sully was the one that got mine, and he read my concept and he was like, "Dude, this really ties back to the art piece that you did, which was that the journey, the immigrant's journey." And so, how do you shape that space was super important. I could be this episode will be we'll have a lot of these images on here because you can't really describe these things without actually
Yeah.
seeing them. But it really became this journey of how I'm moved from Philippines and to America and how that journey was like and how that could emulate itself back into the how you experience the space within the museum that I was designing. And
So
dude, that
basically, it just took an outside perspective to help you refresh a new way to see how your own process or your own concept, I mean, is going to make its way into your project. Someone else's eyes and the way that their brain thinks about what your concept is and your three senses can easily help get you out of that slump. And
Yeah,
now all of a sudden
exactly.
you're back to figuring out, oh, that's a good idea. Like, I can't believe I didn't think about that. And now you're back on track and you're putting the pen to paper again.
that actually blew my mind at the time because Sully, who had nothing to do with my project, suddenly just made me go, "Wow, this is what my
Big brain
project."
mode.
That was like, "This is what my project actually needs." And
Yeah.
dude, that was just like you said, just a different perspective from someone outside of your project. Really helped
So
me
talk
out.
to your studio mates.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
Last thing before we close out. What are some lessons and challenges that we got from this design process of coming up with all the research and creating our good designs into great designs? You know, what are those magical things or those secret sauce that helped us get to the other side, get to those
Right.
great designs that are
Right.
portfolio worthy, I guess.
Yeah, no, because okay, before third year, I was always just research heavy before, but after that third year with Professor Mushroom, Professor Hits Different, it just made me think about concepts in a different way. Because you'd have like research is going to be research no matter what. It's the information that you get from the building, the people, the location, but then how you reflect on those ideas and how you reflect on those set information can then inform how you proceed with your project. And so a big thing that I started then learning, which was a whole different thing, was how do I become more observant about all these different things and start to take in as a sponge and then try to turn those things into conceptual art like architecture.
I wanna jump on that too. I think the magic sauce that gets you from good to great is probably just like almost like working out to get a muscle stronger. I think you just have to keep practicing turning research into concepts and just being very iterative about those concepts. Right? Where this can even happen with just simple charrettes that you do. If you see a coffee cup and just try to come up with like, oh, how can that coffee cup resemble a building or something? You know,
Yeah.
like just some things that don't necessarily seem like they relate quite well, but it's just little fun exercises that you can do that help strengthen your creative muscle, right? And I think that comes back to even like those fun little games that we did in studio, trying to create someone else's concept for 30 minutes or something, or 15 minutes if you don't have that much time, and trying to just think of very creative ways to do certain things, right? Because that's what makes us human, is just thinking creatively about things. I think that's the biggest lesson that I've also pulled from that, maybe from a slightly different angle.
Because I remember, okay, with Nomos, we did these design charrettes where like design a treehouse based on the flavor of sweet and sour.
Yeah,
It was
that
just like
fun.
super fun and super simple. And then now you have to story build about like what is this going to be? Now you have to convince others that this is the best design for this project.
Right.
And it was just so fun, so lighthearted, and it just like what Ryan was like saying, you need to work out this part of your brain so that you can start to think more like this.
Open your third eye.
Yeah. This man smoked the Zaza.
I think I'm trying to think of one more thing of like a big lesson learned from going through 10 design process or more than 10 design processes, 10 semesters of design process. I think a lot of it is our general narrative has been on the podcast for a while, but just bringing it back to meaningful contributions to your community that you're building in, right? The whole research component is exactly that foundation to figure out what that answer is going to be. And honestly, once again, just like flexing the creative muscle, it's also talking to your studio mates, maybe picking up parts and pieces of what their research process looks like and starting to adapt some of those things into your own research process. For example, none of us really thought of doing all these things in our first go. It took our 5 years to figure out like all these major points. And there are still things that I still don't quite see eye to eye with how other people do their process, but it definitely works and comes up with really great buildings, such as like the structure approach or the materiality approach. I don't necessarily connect with that as well as other people do, but they definitely come up with amazing buildings. Look at the future of what this building technology can be, or push boundaries on certain typologies by experimenting with the structure components and whatever else, and researching how those materials can handle certain things, like the whole mycelium stuff, right? Like
Mushrooms.
no one ever really made anything out of that, I don't think, for studio, but it's finding these different materials can definitely influence you to think of different ways to do some things, or 3D printing stuff, right?
Yeah.
How do different manufacturers work? You can basically spend forever researching on a project. So you have to be able to find out what those limits are going to be, where you say, okay, we got enough research, we need to get going.
Right. I think, that thing really ties back to what you said in the beginning of this podcast, which was finding something that you are really wanting to do, finding something that you're passionate about doing.
Yeah.
And then that could really hone in on, like, what thing you're going to be focusing on.
Yeah. Well, shoot, do we want to just wrap it up and do our takeaways?
Yes, sir. Do you want to go first, Ryan, or do you want me to go first?
I want you to go first.
Oh, shoot.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Big takeaway. Do not gloss over research. Research is what lays the biggest foundation for your project, which you can then try to proceed humbly, more respectfully, and also actually just make a project that's super, super meaningful to you, because these are the things that you are interested in or should be interested in. Because if you're not having fun with your project, there's no point in doing that project. You have to be able to have fun and also think about architecture in a more meaningful way.
Yeah. I'm going to tie it a little bit back with what Andrew was saying from last episode as well, about just being very humble with your research, not pretending that you know more than the people who live there, right? Like just being extremely humble, pretend you know nothing about anything, right? Just go into it extremely wide-eyed, or no outside influences. Just put yourself into place and learn from scratch. What is it like to be here? And I think by getting that deeper understanding, that's how you can form these really solid concepts after you do the rest of the research, and combining that with the program of your project brief. And that combination is a powerhouse of potential for competition projects, really solid portfolio projects, and just all of the above. So just, again, ultimately, I think it all just comes down to the people, learning what the people do and why this project is going to be important to them. So, yeah, I mean, there you go. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now you have like the proper ingredients to make a powerful and meaningful project. And, however, the truth is, like, all these tips are great, but they're pointless if you can't really put them into action. So if you want to learn what you need to do to turn all these ideas into winning competition projects, like we said before in this episode, check out our previous episode about how top architecture students nail competitions. It's a great episode. You're going to learn a lot from it, and we'll teach you everything you need to know to get there. So that's it for this episode of the Crit Room Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan, with my co-host,
Albert, just Albert.
And thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys in the next episode.
Don't forget to save.
Bye.
Bye.